Hello, Buddy Crow here, and if you've been a subscriber to my channel for the last year or so, you're probably aware that I was selling off a good portion of my collection. I've actually been doing it for over a year. I wound up selling off about 1,600 games, various systems, accessories, so on and so forth. And the whole reason for that is that I wanted to have games in my collection where I could pull just any game out at random and have a really good, reason for having that game in my collection. Not the type of game where, I pull out Mary Kate and Ashley and I have it just because I didn't have it. That's not a good enough reason to have a game in my collection. I wanted to either, have a game for nostalgia reasons or, really enjoy the game otherwise. And so, yeah, we went through one game at a time and decided whether or not I wanted to put it on the chopping block. But the idea I have for this video series is that I am going to be talking about game systems, accessories, things in my collection, and kind of just talk about why I like them and why they're in my collection to begin with. And I can't think of a better place to start than the very first video game system I can remember, period, and that is the Atari 2600, otherwise known as the Atari VCS, the video computer system. So without further ado, run the title sequence. So the Atari 2600, also known as the Atari VCS, has been around actually just a little bit longer than I've been around. So, all my, childhood memories of video game systems and whatnot are of the Atari 2600. Not only because our family had one, but because pretty much everybody had one at the time. It seemed like every relative that I visited, every friend that I visited, everybody seemed to have an Atari 2600. And in fact, nobody really called it the Atari 2600 or the Atari VCS back then. It was just the Atari. That's all there really was. There was this. I mean, there were some video game systems that came out before this. There were the Pong consoles, I suppose, and there were like the Fairchild Channel F, I believe, came out before this. But the Atari 2600 was the one that was the most popular. It's the one that everybody remembers. So I remember going to other people's houses, rummaging through their games, seeing what games they had that I didn't, and if they had games that I'd never seen before, I wanted to play those games. In fact, the only people I can remember that didn't have an Atari 2600 were my grandparents. They had an Intellivision, and I think the only reason they got the Intellivision is because everybody else had the Atari 2600. And, my cousin at the time had gotten a ColecoVision when they came out, but on top of that, they had an Atari 2600. So everybody had an Atari 2600, or an Atari, as it was just known back then. And the reign of Atari seemed to last up until the NES came out. When the NES came out, that just made everybody I knew forget about the Atari altogether and wanted an NES. But even though there were the Atari 8-bit computers and the Commodore 64 at the time, those computers were coming out, up until the time the NES came out, it seemed like the Atari 2600 was on the minds of everybody, it seemed like. So, with such nostalgia, it's no wonder why I have an Atari 2600 in my collection. The real question is, why do I have 5 Atari 2600s in my collection? Well, like many systems today, there are different variants. There are a ton of different variants of Atari 2600s. So actually what I want to do is I'm going to go through these one at a time and kind of explain why I have each one of these. Alright, this is the first Atari 2600 system I'm going to show off. This is actually the Atari VCS, or Video Computer System. This was before Atari rebranded the line as the 2600. In fact, this is about the second model, I believe, that in the 2600 line. The first being the Heavy Sixer. This is the Light Sixer. And it's called the Sixer because there's 6 switches up in front. You've got the power button on, off. You've got the color in black and white. Now, some people may say, well, what does that matter? The color of black and white just makes the game's color of black and white. Well, there were still a lot of black and white TVs back then. And even though you could still play with color, sometimes the colors in the color mode would kind of bleed together in a black and white television. You wouldn't be able to tell the colors apart. So if you flipped it to black and white mode, it would better define those colors. It'd be easier to play on a black and white television. And I did play this on a black and white television occasionally. Then we have difficulty switches. B is like an easier mode, and A is an expert mode. Some games didn't use this, some games did, and some repurposed these switches for entirely different reasons. Then you have the game select, because a lot of games, they had different levels or different modes of the game. You know, sometimes there's a one-player mode, two-player mode, and just various different modes. And the game reset would usually just reset the game and sometimes start the game. Most early games, you would just flip that to start the game off. And on the back here, let's flip this around. Let's get that in frame there. We got the controller ports. We got right controller and left controller. Usually the left controller would be player 1, and then the right controller would be player 2. I say usually because there were really no rules back then, and some games would say, hey, you know what? We want the right controller to be the first player and the left controller. But the reason it's just labeled left and right is because if you think back to the Pong, because this came out when the days when Pong was still popular, you had the right paddle and the left paddle. So that was the logic in that. You got the power adapter, and then you've got this RF cord which would plug into your TV. Or back in the day, it would plug into a box that you'd flip the switch. I don't think I have any more of those because you can usually just get an adapter and plug these right to the TVs these days. On the bottom somewhere is there's a channel 3, channel 4 switch. There it is. Right here, channel A, B, select. So you'd have to tune your channel to 3 or 4. And just depended on if something was being broadcast on channel 3 or not. Or whatever gave you a better signal. So that is the first model. This actually has a spot. I have an Atari Game Center. Actually, let's cut over to that right now. I can kind of show you that setup. Alright, so here's where this particular Atari 2600 usually hangs out. It hangs out in this Atari Game Center. I actually got this from a store I go to somewhat often called Video Games, etc., or Video Games Then and Now, depending on where you look at it. So, yeah, they had this on the floor, and I asked if he was selling this. He said he was just going to toss it out. And I was like, well, can I have it? And he asked me if I wanted it, and I said, yeah, I'll take it for sure. So, yeah, I have this Atari Game Center here. Basically take off the cover here. And, yeah, it's a nice little thing that you know, matches the wood grain and everything. And if you wanted to, you could store things underneath this. Got some paddle controllers in there right now. And, there we go. A little bit of trouble here. But I think the, yeah, this Atari, it goes really good with this wood grain Zenith here. Space Command. I love that. So, yeah, this TV actually came with the house, and there was no way I was letting this TV go. All this wood grain on here. Looking good with that. So I'm going to pop in a game here. This is Air Sea Battle. Turn this on. I'm going to turn this on. It should be on channel 3. Yes, it is. So, yeah. If I wanted to ever... So this is like the permanent home for this Atari 2600. And you're going to get some flickering on the screen just because that's the way these things get filmed. But yeah, it's a really great picture for... Yeah, I mean, it really complements this Atari very well. And it's really kind of... is really like what it was like to play the games way back in the day on a TV like this. In fact, I would have loved to have a TV like this back in the day. So this really takes me back. So that's why I keep this around. To have this awesome TV with this system here, just always hooked up. If I ever get the urge to pop in and play some Atari 2600, I got this right here. So let's actually take a look at the next Atari 2600 I want to show you guys. Alright, next 2600 I want to show you is this Telegames Video Arcade. Now you may be wondering, where's the Atari logo? Is this a knockoff system? What's going on here? Well, if you're not familiar with what went on back in the day, it turns out Sears would not sell other branded products. So in order to get the Atari 2600 into Sears, it had to be rebranded as a Sears product. So Sears came up with this line, Telly Games, and just called it the Video Arcade. So this is where this Atari 2600 came from. It came from Sears. There's a slightly different faux wood thing here. In fact, it's more of a marbleized effect here. But you've got the same switches. You've got the on-off. Some of them are labeled a little bit differently, but you still got the black and white in color. You got the instead of A and B, it says Novice and Expert on both sides here, and then still you got the game select and reset. Now, why do I have this one? This was actually the model. It's not the very same system, but it's the same model of the one we had in our house when I was growing up. And I always wondered why this never said Atari 2600 or Atari anywhere on it. And it turns out, I found out later, well, it came from Sears, and Sears had to have their own brand and everything back in those days, because Sears was king back then. They could do whatever they want. But otherwise, it's pretty much exactly the same. You still in the back, you've got your RF cable attached to it. You've got your right controller. You got the power. Everything's exactly the same, just a slightly different look. But I keep this one solely because of nostalgia purposes. This was the model I had. So let's move on to the next one I have. Alright, this is what's known as the Vader model Atari 2600, and I'll be honest, this is not in the best of shape at all. In fact, here's a couple extra pieces. See what happened? Well, let me just talk about this a little bit. They came out with a 4-switch model, which eliminated the difficulty switches. They're actually on the other side here, novice, expert switches on the back here instead of actual switches on the top. And the controller ports are up here and everything. The channel switch has been moved up here. But most noticeably, this is the first model that actually had the 2600 branding on it instead of the faux wood. It's just black. I actually prefer the faux wood look as opposed to the Vader model. A lot of people like the Vader model. But what's going on with these pieces, you might ask? Well, about 4 years ago, my dad had sent me an email, or he actually talked to me on the phone. He didn't need to send me an email, saying that he found this whole bunch of computer stuff and he was going to send it to me. And he said one of them was an Atari 2600. Now, this isn't the model I thought he was going to send me. I thought he was going to send me another model. In fact, I don't even remember anybody having a Vader model 2600 back in the day. But I guess this had to come from my uncle, because he's the only one I would have known that would have had one of these. But thing was, when he shipped it, he did a really bad job of packing it, and this whole bottom shattered. In fact, it's still falling apart here. But I re-glued it, and that was several years ago, so the glue is not really doing a good job. You can kind of see all the glue marks. The glue's coming undone here. Got tape on it. In fact, I've taken the RF cord out of here, so it's not really, this model isn't really usable at the moment. But I figure someday I might be able to find another 2600 and replace the bottom. That's really the only reason I'm holding on to this for right now, because it's really just the bottom shell that's all busted up. So I guess I could glue this back together again, but after time it'll just fall apart, unless I use some better glue maybe. But I did test this out after I put it back together, and it did work. So that's why I'm keeping this. Maybe one day I can get this back totally into restorable condition. But it is nice to have the Vader model, but not, even though it's not one of my favorites. But I'm just holding on to this. Really can't sell it in the condition it's in. So let's just move on to another 2600 I have. Alright, next up we have another Light Sixer. Now, this may look exactly like the very first one I showed off, but I've actually done some modifications to this one. And actually all these modifications came from Vintage Gaming and More. Actually did these in the summer of 2012. You may be able to see, but the very first thing here is an LED light. I actually can't remember what color this lights up. I think it's orange, or it's either orange or blue. I'll splice in some video of that working right now. But again, exactly the same as the other ones. But on the opposite side, we can see here, no RF cable. Instead, we've got the, let's get this better into frame here, we've got the composite out. And even though there is stereo left and right, this still it's in mono. It's the same coming out of both. I just did that so I wouldn't need a Y adapter to plug into any devices. But yeah, better audio video signal out. That's why I use this most of the time. So, and a lot of the captured footage I do for the Atari 2600 these days, this is the system I actually use, because I actually prefer the 6 switch model over the 4 switch model, just because I like having these switches at the go. Not to say that the 4 switch model is bad with the switches on the back here, but yeah, I do have one more system left to show, so let's just jump to that. So again, after I actually got the kits for the mods on the other Atari 2600, I wound up getting the same mods again, because I wanted to do the mod for the 4 switch model I have here, which is it's a 4 switch model before the Vader version, but you've got the LED light here. Again, I can't remember what color it is. I'm going to splice in footage of this light working right now. But we've got the power on off, we got the color black and white, same thing as usual. I'll get to this switch later. And again, we got the AV out in just a slightly different position on this one than I did on the other one. But again, we have the, just like the Vader model, the channel 4 switch here, which does nothing on this version now that you use this instead. Then you've got the difficulty switches. But let's get to the switch here. I remember, I can't remember if the person from the Vintage Gaming and more knew that I had a YouTube channel or was just familiar with me or something for some way, because when they fulfilled my order, they threw in this switch for free. This is an extra mod. What this does is let you pause the game, and I was like, sure, I'll test it out. I think they were testing it out and seeing how easy it was to install. It was actually really easy to install, I remember. So the down is unpaused. When you flip it up, the game pauses, but it doesn't pause like you would think. It doesn't like just keep a crystal clear image of what the action on screen. Instead, the screen goes all crazy. But then when you flip it back down, you resume where you left off. So it's an interesting mod. I still prefer using the other one just because it's a 6 switcher. But I wanted to have a 6 switcher modded and a 4 switcher modded, so that's what I had. So there were some models of Atari 2600s that I did have that I wound up selling off for various reasons. There was the Atari 2600 Junior that I had. I sold that off. I just didn't like the small form factor. It just felt really light and flimsy to me. I didn't like the switches on it. Granted, it did have better output, but with the mods I've done on systems like these, there was really no reason for me to keep that system, especially me not liking exactly how it looked. And then there was the Coleco Gemini, which was Coleco's answer to the 2600. It was their own version of the 2600 built with off-the-shelf parts. Now, that would never fly these days. Could you imagine if Microsoft built their own PS4? No, that would never fly. But back in the day, it worked, and I think Atari tried to sue them for that, but since it was built with off-the-shelf parts and reverse engineered, there was nothing they could do about it. So, yeah, the reason I didn't like that one is because I didn't like, for some reason the plastic seemed really light and flimsy on that. All the metal pieces, I don't know what it was, but I got shocked every time I touched that thing. It came with its own controllers. You had the paddles and joysticks built in one. I'll get into those shortly. The joystick part of it were okay, but I didn't like the paddle part of it. All in all, I just did not like playing on the thing. Again, I prefer playing on a system like this as opposed to one of ColecoVision's, not ColecoVision's, but Coleco's system, version of the system, as it were. They also had adapters for the ColecoVision. Again, why? I mean, I can see the reason back then. If you could buy ColecoVision and buy the adapter, you had no reason to buy an Atari. But there's no really real use for it these days. I think if you have a you could just get a 2600 to play those games. You don't really need the adapter. I think. In fact, I think the system, you can get the Atari 2600 system cheaper than the adapter. So there's no reason. But let's talk about controllers. I was actually looking for the best looking controller I had. I really can't find one right now. You see that this is kind of your standard Atari 2600 controller. You know, this is the color that was all the way around it, but it's been worn off, whatnot. These were okay. I played with these a lot. But actually my favorite joystick to use is this. It's the Suncom Slick Stick. I have two of these. One works better than the other, but I think I could, if I work at the other one, I can pretty much get them to work the same. I just like the tighter movements. It's not clicking because there's micro switches. It's just the noise that it makes. But I don't, I could do better with the smaller button. It's kind of a smaller joystick, but again, I just like it because it's a shorter distance movement, and you definitely know when you're making contact. I do have this, and I'll probably show this off in a later video too, because I really made this for the Atari 2600 or 7800. But this NES adapter with a NES controller adapted to work with 9-pin systems. I made this for the 7800, but this will work with the Atari as well. But for Atari games, I still prefer to use this slick stick here. Then, of course, we have paddle controllers here. Now there's 2 paddles for every one jack here. So if you had 2 sets of these, which I do, you could actually play 4-player games without any sort of adapter. Now these, this is really kind of the main attraction of the Atari 2600 these days, I think, because there's really no system that has these kind of controllers standard anymore. And even like the Arkanoid VOS controller for the NES, they don't seem to work as good as these for some reason. Especially when you take these apart and clean them, these will always work phenomenal. I think if you're having a problem with yours jittery or whatnot, you could look up instructions online just to take these apart. All you gotta do is clean it off with some rubbing alcohol, put it back together, and it works like new. So yeah, you got the paddle controller. Then we have this driving controller, which doesn't work with that many games. It may look very similar to the paddle controllers, but the main difference here is that this doesn't stop. There's nothing with the paddle controllers. They'll stop at a certain turning point, but this will just keep going and going and going and going. Indy 500, I know, works with it. I don't know if there's any other games that work with it. There might be, and I just don't know what they are offhand. And then of course there's keyboard controllers, but I actually don't have any keyboard controllers at the moment. I don't think I have any games that use the keyboard controllers. I remember having those when I was a kid and playing, I think it was Code Breakers with that, but I don't have those anymore. So I think that pretty much covers, me and the Atari 2600. What I'm going to end with are just, a shot of some games that I really like for the 2600. Thanks everyone for watching. See you next time. Bye.